and welcome to the 18th episode of Nations of Charlemagne, the 30 Years' War. Now, whilst this lecture is called the 30 Years' War, I want to make it very clear that we're starting much earlier. We're starting in 1555 with the Peace of Augsburg. The reason is that the war itself is very confused when it comes to most people's understanding of the political and religious reasons behind it. And with 1555, we have the Great Peace of Augsburg. And at the end of this time period, with 1648, we have the Peace of Westphalia. And really, in terms of bookmarking this conversation, it really only makes sense if you look at within the context of those two pieces. The one that ended the Schmalkaldic Wars and resulted in the abdication of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, and what we have in 1648, which is the general peace concluding 30 years on and off conflict within the empire, which has also by this time evolved into a major European war between primarily the Spanish and the French. So without further ado, I'll just pick off from the last lecture conversation we had concerning this period, which of course was on Charles V. At the end of that lecture, Charles V had briefly been able to defeat the forces of the Protestants, the Schmalkaldic League, only to be defeated by his own Saxon protege, Maurice of the Albertine line. And by 1552, he had been defeated. The Protestants were ascendant in northern Germany, and the French had intervened because the bookmark also of the period of the Peace of Augsburg is the end of the Italian wars at the same time. So we have this major feud between the Spanish, the Habsburgs, and the Spanish Habsburgs, the Habsburgs generally, and the French. So at this time, the Peace of Augsburg, we're seeing the near close of the of that conflict of the Italian wars, and we're seeing the failed attempt of Charles V to impose some sort of religious unity. First of all, he does it through the attempts of various diets, colloquies, trying to get Protestants and Catholics to talk. The initiative is then taken away from him when the Pope Paul III convenes the Council of Trent. So there isn't going to be an ecumenical council between Protestants and Catholics. This falls apart. And by 1555, he's militarily defeated, and he is also betrayed by his own family. So the idea of a Habsburg patrimony ruling over the entire sort of vast domain of the Habsburgs, everything from Spain to modern-day Belgium to Naples to Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary, has been undone. And now we see the division into two lines, the Austrian branch and the Spanish branch. And it's within that context that we start this conversation. So the Peace of Augsburg established peace between Catholic and Lutheran states, not Protestant states. When I refer to Protestantism in this conversation, it is going to refer to all branches of the Reformed tradition, whereas this is specifically Lutheranism. Lutheran states and Catholic states were afforded the right, the Latin right of cuius regio, eius religio, which essentially means the ruler determines the state. Determines the state religion. So Catholic denizens of Lutheran principalities were encouraged or really forced to convert to Lutheranism and vice versa. And therefore you see a massive amount of migration throughout all these various principalities depending on the religion of the ruler. The exception to this was the idea of the Ecclesiastical Reserve, or the Reservatum Ecclesiasticum, wherein if there is a prelate of an ecclesiastical state, so for example, you have the four great clerical electors, you have the Elector of Mainz, you have the Elector of Cologne, you have the Elector of Trier, three. And these are very powerful archbishops with ecclesiastical possessions, as we see later with Cologne. The assumption is that if one bishop is to convert, say, for example, from Catholicism to Calvinism, he is expected to give up that position rather than force his entire state to convert to the new religion. As all of these states, were predominantly Catholic, this of course favored the Catholics and was a major source of contention going forward, especially when it comes to the religious status of various dioceses across in the heart of Protestant territory. So from the start of this agreement, Lutheranism continues to expand beyond the 1555 borders set, while the reform, while Catholicism begins the reform tradition and begins the process of reconversion, armed with the various regulations of the Council of Trent, which was the subject of our last lecture here. The final session of that council, by the way, concludes in 1563. So all of this is happening around the same time. Peace between Spain and France in 1559, the Peace of Augsburg, 1555, the final session of the Council of Trent in 1563, really setting the temper of the era moving forward. Now, what is left out of this agreement is Calvinism. Calvinism is still relatively new in the grand scheme of things. John Calvin has only recently set up his power base in Geneva, and we're only just beginning to see the conversion of French nobility and in the 1560s, Dutch nobility to Calvinism. So it is unrecognized by this peace, and it is treated with a degree of hostility from both Catholics and Lutherans. And this division among the Protestant traditions is nothing new. We see the early division of the Protestants during the German Peasants' War of the 1520s with the Anabaptists, and of course Luther's admonition against the peasants in that war. And also we have various impasses before John Calvin. For example, we have the Swiss reformer Zwingli, who again represents the Swiss tradition, which is slightly distinct from that of Calvin. And Zwingli and Luther famously were unable to resolve their various differences at the Marburg colloquy in I believe it was around the year 1530. But despite the religious disunity of the empire, the electors retained their status guaranteed by the Golden Bull of 1356. And if you remember, going back to that, there are 7 electors. There are 7 sort of grand princes of the empire. In addition to the 3 ecclesiastical princes, we have the 4 temporal princes. In this case, this is the King of Bohemia, the Elector of Saxony, the Elector of Brandenburg, and the Elector of the Palatinate. Whilst we have this major religious upheaval, it should be noted that all of the impetus of the Reichsreform, which had been established under the Emperor Maximilian at the beginning of the 16th century, which again is a part of a previous conversation of the rise of the Habsburgs, that is still in place. So we still have the idea of the Reichskreis, or the imperial circle, where we have these tiny little statelets who within certain spheres have common defensive structures and common taxation for the general penny. These, circles, for example, we have the Lower Saxon and the Upper Saxon circles, the Bavarian circle, the Burgundian circle, which includes part of the lowlands, etc. We have the Imperial Diet, or Reichstag, but of course I won't use that title because it'll be very confusing to people familiar with more recent German history and contemporary German politics. And this Imperial Diet continues to meet on an irregular basis at 3 principal cities, Regensburg, Augsburg, and Speyer. And it remains a consultative assembly rather than the legislature. It is supposed to aid and consult the emperor and assist in imperial administration, essentially like we see with the Estates General in France. It's not supposed to supplant or challenge imperial authority, but to facilitate it. And when you enact edicts or laws through the Imperial Diet, it gives the impression of consensus and harmony in the realm. So this is not equivalent to a modern legislature, as we could see from the 19th century. Now, 2 courts also exist, 2 supreme courts, to use a rather debased term, are in prominence after the Peace of Augsburg. We have the Imperial Chamber Court, which of course, and the Aulic Court. Both of these were set up about 50 years before and have various overlapping jurisdictions. The former deals with breaches of the peace, unlawful seizure of property, imprisonment, and general violations of the emperor's edicts, and criminal charges under Imperial Immediacy. And what Imperial Immediacy means, you have all these various territories who have their own rulers. Say, for example, take the Elector of Saxony, a place in the Holy Roman Empire which has Imperial Immediacy, like a free and imperial city, is nominally a place which has no higher authority, no sort of local lord or local authority other than that of the emperor himself. So and also it should be noted that looking at the composition of the Aulic Council is quite a good way to conceive of the mindset of the Emperor Ferdinand, the emperor who follows in Charles's footsteps, as his council consists of appointees which have a more or less religious parity. So there are Lutheran members of that council, and there are Catholic members of that council, and the Lutherans on that council can in effect have a veto on the decisions made by the Catholics, but also it should be asserted that the council was made up of imperial appointees. So yes, there was religious diversity, but the idea is that they were all loyal to the emperor, regardless of their religious affiliation. Now, Charles V had, of course, abdicated the imperial throne in 1556, unmaking this dream of a unified House of Habsburg as universal monarchs of Christendom. Charles's son, Philip II, now head of the House of Burgundy, becomes King of Spain, and within the Holy Roman Empire, Lord of the Netherlands and Duke of Milan, making this very confusing, that we have the Spanish branch holding on to possessions within the Holy Roman Empire, whilst the actual Holy Roman Emperor rules over Bohemia, Austria, and Hungary, and is also the Holy Roman Empire after this point. So Ferdinand's Charles's brother Ferdinand, who had ruled Austria in his brother's name since 1521, now succeeds him as Holy Roman Emperor. In Bohemia, Ferdinand had already crushed an alliance of the Hussites and the Lutherans, of course, linking back again to this earlier conversation. The Hussites were a very old sort of proto-reformist sect, which had waged a series of wars at the beginning of the 15th century against the king Wenceslaus IV and the Emperor Sigismund. So at this point, we're having the Hussites and the Lutherans forming an early alliance, which is going on at the same time that we have the Schmalkaldic War, which has been prosecuted by Charles. The Bohemian rebels are defeated, and Ferdinand is able to recover the Catholic position to some extent, and he's also allowed to bring in the Jesuits, who had only just recently been established by St. Ignatius a few years before, and they begin the process of reconversion towards Catholicism. Now, unlike Charles, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, Ferdinand was genuinely popular among the princes, and also bears the greatest responsibility for drafting the terms of the Peace of Augsburg. The Declaratio Ferdinandae is perhaps the greatest expression of his own flexible policy towards religion in the empire. Loyalty to the emperor was paramount, and Ferdinand reserved to himself the right to mediate the religious situation in the empire, either directly or indirectly through his courts. Imperial knights loyal to the emperor and various nobles were permitted their own religious traditions under this scheme, and of course, this scheme was at odds with then Pope Paul IV, who refused to recognize the new emperor. Paul IV believed that when Charles V made this agreement with the Lutherans, the Peace of Augsburg, he was committing treason against the Pope, and as part of this ongoing sort of end feud between the French and the Spanish going on until 1559. Paul IV uses this to drag out the recognition of the new settlement. It's only finally recognized by his successor Pius IV, I believe, in 1562. Now, Ferdinand is succeeded as emperor by his son Maximilian II, and he continues in this vein of religious reconciliation. And it's at this time where we see the high watermark of Protestantism in Austria itself, not just in Germany, but in Austria. And the remarkable thing about the Austrian Habsburgs, as opposed to the Spanish Habsburgs, is that Emperor Maximilian II, had he had no had the Spanish branch of the family had no influence, he would have gone further in doing everything possible to appease the various Protestants, bar possibly converting, including repudiating the regulations of the Council of Trent and trying to permit things such as clerical marriages. And it's only the Catholic opposition of Philip II of Spain, his cousin, which prevents him doing so and giving even more concessions to the Protestants. Now, turning to the other princes of the empire, I have a selection of images up here, as you can see. We have Augustus of Saxony, who succeeds from his father Maurice, the great victor of the Schmalkaldic War against Charles V, as Elector of Saxony. To make things all a bit more complicated, it's not simply a matter of Protestants v Catholics, as I will be at pains to emphasize throughout the rest of this lecture, in the sense that Protestant hopes focused on the Elector Augustus as a potential unifying force for Lutherans in Germany. However, Augustus was more concerned to hold up the new peace in the empire, and to this end he allied with the Habsburgs. And the reason he also did this was because when we have the Schmalkaldic League, the previous Elector of Saxony is deposed and Maurice is put in his place. Despite the fact that Maurice then turns against the emperor who made him the elector, we now have a major division between the Albertines and Ernestine branches of the House of Wettin, which is the house which rules over Saxony. And so the Elector Augustus is very much concerned with preventing a resurgence from the Ernestine branch of the family and taking this domain back. So very confusingly, at the same time, we have an Elector of Saxony which holds prominence over a Duke of Saxony. And the Duke of Saxony's territories aren't in modern-day Saxony, but in Thüringen or Thuringia. And just to emphasize how much of a dire threat this was in terms of this dynastic sort of War of the Roses in Saxony, John Augustus's cousin, John Frederick, attempted a coup against him in 1566, and this was subsequently placed under the ban by the emperor. The ban, of course, is basically a writ of outlawry, where a person, is declared an outlaw. And John Frederick, Duke of Saxony, spent the next 30 years in prison and was nearly executed. Moving on to Brandenburg, because I'm sure a lot of you will want to know the origins of Prussia. Prussia as we sort of know it. Joachim Hector, the Elector of Brandenburg, converted to Lutheranism in 1539. And from 1574, Brandenburg begins to accept various Calvinist refugees from the Netherlands. This is 8 years after the Dutch revolt has begun in earnest. Now, a later Elector of Brandenburg, John Sigismund, converts from Lutheranism to Calvinism in 1613, and he attempts to employ this idea of Quies regio, eius religio, this idea that the ruler then has to adopt the ruled have to adopt the religion of the ruler, and he tries a mass conversion, and this is met with universal opposition. Not only is it illegal as per terms of the Peace of Augsburg, because Calvinism hasn't been recognized yet, but is even opposed by his wife Anna of Prussia, who holds Prussia in her own right, and therefore this causes a major sort of political crisis. So he's forced to back down. And him backing down has two effects. It means that when Anna of Prussia dies and Sigismund is replaced by his son, Prussia and Brandenburg become one state, and this is the origin of the Kingdom of Prussia in 1618. It's not called the Kingdom of Prussia yet. It's still called the Electorate of Brandenburg, or the Margravate of Brandenburg as well, and the Duchy of Prussia. And these two polities will be formed some 80 years later. And of course, the conversion of the elector to Calvinism leaves this odd situation of where you have a biconfessional faith, you have a biconfessional state rather. You have a Calvinist princely family ruling over a Lutheran population, and this continues for some 200 years when you have the Prussian Union, the churches, all the way in 1817. Now, going on to Catholic Germany, Bavaria had reunited after the division of the 14th and 15th centuries, very much echoing what had also happened to the Habsburg lands, if you recall that earlier lecture. And the way to resolve this was the so-called everlasting succession, meaning that from 1545, the then Duke of Bavaria, William IV, ruled over the entire Bavarian Wittelsbach patrimony, and this becomes one of the largest little statelets within Germany, one of the largest principalities, and it dominates an entire circle of the empire, the Bavarian circle. And from this point, Bavaria becomes the major Catholic power other than that of the Habsburgs. And this often leads to rivalry and contention with the Habsburgs and the Wittelsbachs. And of course, this reaches a peak in the 18th century. But it should be emphasized that despite the power of Catholic Bavaria, the Bavarian branch remained the lesser of the Wittelsbach branches, the Palatinate branch possessing an electoral dignity as one of the four electors alongside the ones aforementioned. And to make things even worse, for the Bavarian branch, the Palatinate branch had converted to Lutheranism in the 1530s, and then under Frederick III, who I have an image in the center, from 1559 he becomes the elector, and he has converted to a very much sincere and devout form of Calvinism. And so much so that he's actually responsible for promulgating the Heidelberg Catechism, which is a manual for Calvinist religious instruction. And thereafter, until the 17th century, the electors of the Palatinate shall be fierce Calvinists. And just look in the contrast, the reformist fervor of the Palatinate branch in complete contrast to the Bavarian branch. And of course, this would lead to devastating conflict when we get to the 30 Years' War. Now on to the question of Re-Catholicization after the onslaught and the rise of Protestantism. By the time of Ferdinand's death, so that's Emperor Ferdinand of the Holy Roman Empire in 1564, Protestantism had become endemic in Austria itself. Ancient institutions such as the University of Vienna which had been patronized by the Emperor Maximilian and become a center of humanism in Germany, Renaissance humanism, declined from 6,000 students at its peak around 1510 to as few as 30 students just after the first siege of Vienna by the Ottomans, partly because it was seen as a Catholic institution, and if anything, that should see the complete brain drain in the empire and within the Austrian possessions themselves, away from Catholicism and towards Protestantism. Ferdinand's solution was to make this institution, the university, more Catholic by associating it with the Jesuits, akin to his response already in Bohemia. And to make matters worse, Austria pursued various religious lines depending on their local rulers. So Austria, once again, is divided among the sons of Ferdinand I. So we have the Emperor Maximilian II, who rules the territories around Vienna and also rules over Hungary and Bohemia. But this is subject to major influence at the hands of the local nobles. And it should be noted that Hungary is still partitioned between the Ottoman Turks and Transylvania, which is an Ottoman vassal, but still claims some lordship over all of Hungary. And these two rulers are, again, the situation hasn't existed since Frederick III and Maximilian I. And the brothers of Maximilian II, who rule over the other parts of Austria, are Karl and Ferdinand. And unlike Maximilian II, who I mentioned was a very sort of much willing to appease Protestantism for the sake of stability, they were emphatic supporters of the Tridentine reform and its attempts at Re-Catholicization. And to that end, they both patronized the arts and the budding sort of Mannerist and Baroque movements, and of course brought in the Jesuit order into Austria. And this zeal is replicated by the Bavarian dukes, Albert V and William V, of course known to history as the Pious, who oversaw the construction of the Wilhelminum, the old Jesuit academy, and St. Michael's Church in Munich. And to anyone who essentially goes there, it's a beautiful church. But this church is significant and essentially sets the temper for the entire South German Baroque style, which is going to permeate through the first half of the 17th century. Now, I'm not sure how many of you have been to Munich, but when walking around, especially the old center of Munich, the Munich Residence, in its current state, which was constructed from the 16th to the 17th century, one can't help but feel the Italian influence, especially the Florentine influence, and later that Tridentine era architecture. Especially it puts me in mind of the Medici ducal residence, the Palazzo Pitti, which became the ducal residence after the Florentines moved right out of the city centre. Now, to try and emphasize the process of you could say Re-Catholicization, I have a very sort of secular-minded article, which is one of the set reading pieces for the conversation on Monday by Peter Thaler. And also, I do want to emphasize that after this lecture is over, I will be answering questions. So if you have any questions you would like to ask, please do so, because I'm available to answer them. By the early 17th century, the Counter-Reformation had made visible progress in the Habsburgs' Alpine and Danubian provinces, which formed the core of their hereditary lands. In Austria, the practice of Lutheranism was legally restricted to the indigenous nobility, even in everyday life in Carinthia and Upper Styria, still deviated from the princely prescriptions. Yet also in the Archduchy itself, the restoration of Catholic supremacy had advanced. The reason for the success had been vividly debated. Based on her careful examination of Styrian conditions, Regina Portner concluded that the Counter-Reformation in the Habsburg monarchy relied heavily on the government and formed a crucial part of state building by strengthening the power of the monarch and providing an ideology of state. Arno Herzig similarly emphasized the role of the state and its insistence of loyalty and conformity. Now, again, I think when sort of prescribing this sort of things like the idea of state, the ideology of state, it should be noted at this point that the state is assumed to be the monarch, and the estates are not part of the state. Rather, they form something quite distinct from the monarch. And when the monarch is acting in accordance with the estates, he's acting as essentially exhibiting the will of the entire Commonwealth. So when we talk about the state, we're not talking about the state as we would conceive it. And I very much doubt if these historians were pressed, they would adopt that term. So they're talking about the ideology of the monarch. And by extension, they wouldn't refer to it as such, but as an ideology of the monarch. So we're talking about the religion of the monarch. And going back to the defense Charles V used in the Concord out of Worms, which really sets the idea that to be Catholic, to be Habsburg is to be Catholic, is because the Maximilian had created this wonderful association, this wonderful sort of grand history, or this imperial myth of the Habsburg dynasty. The idea of remaining Catholic is very much associated with fidelity to one's ancestors, carrying on the Habsburg tradition. So the idea for Charles V, which very much continues throughout the vast majority of the Catholics thereafter, is the idea that if you are to abjure your faith and become an apostate from Catholicism, you have essentially not only betrayed your religion, but you have become anathema to the idea of being Habsburg. Howard Lothan's analysis of Bohemia, whose conditions differed little from those in the Alpine hereditary lands, complemented established images of governmental coercion with a stronger emphasis on the mass appeal of Baroque Catholicism. Based on the interaction of Catholic reformers, the local populace in the Traunvettel district of Upper Austria, in turn, Joseph Patou concluded that the process was not unilaterally steered by authorities, but consistently negotiated between rulers and the ruled. Again, this notion of the state as personified by the monarch and his apparatchiks, and of the estates. A pragmatic approach took shape in the late 1500s. At the Munich Conference of 1579, Charles II of Inner Austria, Ferdinand II of Tyrol, and of course these are the lesser Habsburg rulers ruling over parts of Austria, not the emperor should be noted as part of this, who was by this time Rudolf II. William V of Bavaria agreed on a program for the Re-Catholicization of Inner Austria. The religious concessions to the pacification needed to be cancelled, as the German the idea essentially is the abolition of religious privileges could be accomplished not through an official revocation, but through a prudent strategy that bypassed the Diet. So essentially, they're unofficially trying to bring Catholicism back, whilst not sort of maintaining their allegiance to the spirit of the Peace of Augsburg. The focus should be on actions rather than words, and on a gradual process rather than an immediate and all-out assault. In a 1519 memorandum to the Vice-Regent Archduke Ernst, Bishop Klessel, who later plays a very prominent part in the Habsburg strategy just before Ferdinand II, recommends a similar approach throughout Austria. Strategically important for the dynasty was the separation of urban and noble representations in the Diet. The constitutional position of the territorial towns had long been contested. In theory, their territorial status derived from superior autonomy, whereas numerous comparable communities were subjected to worldly or spiritual lords. The territorial municipalities stood directly under the monarch Imperial Immediacy. As a consequence, they traditionally enjoyed autonomous representation in the Diet. No Austrian cities lastingly rose to Imperial Immediacy, however. With the increase in political and confessional tensions, the Habsburgs intensified their attempts to merge the territorial municipalities into their personal state. Urban curiae councils were not dissolved, but the rulers refused to include them in their many estate privileges. In particular, the monarchs challenged the right of urban representatives, as their alleged domain subjects, to contravene government policy in the Diet. Municipal councils throughout the Archduchy fervently protested their demotion, but they received only half-hearted support from the aristocracy, whereas these most Protestant segments of society upheld a confessional alliance in neighbouring Hungary, as visible in their firm stance against the monarch at the Diet of 1604. The Protestant nobles of Austria increasingly surrendered their urban co-religionists. Primarily, this abandonment expressed a desire not to link their own legally protected position to the vulnerable status of the urban populace. Yet many aristocrats were also driven by a desire to preserve their elevated social standing. They sympathized with the religious aspirations of the Lutheran town councils, but held little enthusiasm for enhancing their political influence. So what we're seeing here is various conflicts within the estate. So of course, the urban centers are the vehicles for the artisans, the vehicles for the guilds, the vehicles for the third estate. So what we're seeing here is that the Protestant nobility, and again, this is a very similar process we see in France. The fact that the Calvinists have, vastly over-indexed in the minor nobility, all the way up to Le Condé and the Bourbon dynasty. But the idea here is that the Protestant nobles of Austria are prepared to surrender some influence for the Lutherans in order that the various cities don't become too powerful at their expense. The advance of the Counter-Reformation in the territorial municipalities gradually reduced the confessional dispute in the Archduchy to a confrontation between monarch and Protestant nobility. Due to the large-scale replacement of the obstinate city councils and the monarch's refusal to tolerate urban opposition in religious matters, the urban curiae no longer formed a political counterweight to the diets. These territorial diets formed the central arena for the denominational confrontation, however. The final phase of the conflict witnessed the formulation of a coherent ideology of state among segments of the Protestant nobility. This ideology defined the estates as guardians of territory and its laws, and as a constitutional counterweight to monarchical dominance. It may seem peculiar that this estatist ideology flourished during a time when societal power had shifted decisively to the monarch. Yet for a long time, Austria's Protestant nobles had tried to reconcile their denominational autonomy with political loyalty to the crown. Aristocrats were not rebels by nature, and they believed in and profited from a hierarchical structure that placed them below the monarch but above the bulk of society. As a consequence, Protestant officials such as Siegmund von Dietrichstein and Gotthard von Starhemberg willingly executed their prince's orders to crush peasant rebellions. Even these insurgencies had unmistakably religious undertones. And of course, this is the exact same thing we see earlier with the German Peasants' War, in that the Lutheran princes and Luther himself were more than willing to crush peasant rebellions so that it enhanced the powers of the nobility. This temporarily increased the power of the Catholics, but it majorly increased the power of the soon-to-be Lutheran nobles. It took a fundamental challenge to their inherited status and privileges to incite the well-to-do profiteers of feudal society to open resistance. Therefore, it appears only logical that the most radical formulation of a statist opposition took shape when its protagonists felt endangered politically as well as economically. Catholic restoration required a confessional homogenization of government. The Habsburgs made a concerted effort to reinforce the Catholic aristocracy, whereas the established nobility had largely embraced the new faith. 2/5 of the newly admitted laws between 1580 and 1620 were Catholics, and Protestants faced ever more stringent impediments in their final pre-war years. The pattern of admission to the knightly estate was more changeable, with Catholics advancing most rapidly during the reign of co-religious curial vice presidents at the turn of the 17th century, and Protestant temporarily reversed this trend after 1609. 1609, of course, is the time where we have the famous Bohemian Letter of Majesty promulgated by Rudolf II, which allows the Bohemians essentially the right to practice free religion, or not free religion as we know it, but Lutheranism, etc. From a political perspective, it proved especially significant that the reinvigorated Catholic minority established its own curial faction in 1606. Henceforth, there existed an organizational loyalist opposition that placed its ties to the ruler above any community of interest with their Protestant peers, in view of the generous rewards for personal promotion and public service available to one confessional subgroup at the expense of the other. This community of interest had become limited in any case. Internal division diminished the autonomous power of the estates and prevented coordinated resistance. Although the policy of selected noblemen to promotion achieved many of its strategic goals, it also radicalized the opposition, as we're going to see. So on that case, we're talking about the subtle attempts of Re-Catholicization. We, of course, talked about the Jesuit schools in addition to everything else, but this is talking about the political aspects and incentives and the fact that the Protestant nobility were unwilling to ally with the Third Estate. And of course, we see a similar process in France, whereby, ironically, the religious conflict as a means to massively expand the power of the monarch. In the sense, the Protestants relied on the fact that they owed some sort of immediacy, some sort of vertical relationship with the king. The fact that the King of France, whether it be Charles IX or Henry III, could alone guarantee their rights and act as an arbitrator. Whereas if you look to the ancient institutions such as the Estates General, they were overwhelmingly pro-Catholic and weren't prepared to stand up for this institution. So again, we're seeing the monarch essentially, holding these and preserving these Protestant nobles and their privileges at the expense of the estates. And what we're seeing here is the inability of the Protestant nobility to ally with some more sort of radical religious segments in the lower population. But it should be noted here that Thaler makes no specific mention of who the monarch emperor was. So, of course, he doesn't mention the fact that Austria had 3 rulers, all of them with majorly different religious tempers. As we've already seen with Maximilian II, the emperor, and Ferdinand I, the Imperial Habsburgs differed in their approaches to their Austrian peers, let alone Philip II of Spain. Rudolf II is remembered for his support of late Renaissance humanism, the arts, and the occult. When observing his opposition to the expansion of the Turks in Hungary in defense of Christendom, one should contrast this with what could be referred to as his lax Catholicism or his Catholicism in abeyance. And when we see essentially what the role of Protestantism was to him, Protestantism and conciliarism was a form of a counterweight to papal influence. And when we talk about Cecil later on, he refers to Ferdinand II as a Jesuit puppet. When looking back at Charles V and various figures such as Gattinara, we're seeing all of these figures, all of these ideas, which have been used to undermine papal authority, but remain some sort of confessional unity. So what we're seeing here with Rudolf II is that Rudolf II is more or less prepared to play, a flexible role like his two predecessors, in order to prevent essentially the emperor becoming nothing more than the puppet of the Pope. What was considered his failing to deal effectively with the Turkish threat, because of course the Ottomans are pressing into Hungary, and they're always they've just recently attacked Vienna in 1529. It should also be noted that Rudolf II is associated with reports of homosexuality and continuous affairs, and the siring of many bastards, and this leads to a remarkable situation where, like his Bohemian predecessor, Wenceslaus IV, the childless Rudolf was deposed by his cousin Matthias in 1608 and ultimately imprisoned for the last year of his nominal reign as Holy Roman Emperor from 1611 until 1612, the so-called Brothers' Quarrel. And this is all the more confusing because Rudolf is not responsible necessarily for all the major impediments which contribute to his downfall. So, for example, Matthias is responsible for the notorious piece of Zistvartorok, which gives many concessions to the Hungarians and the Calvinists, and is used as essentially a pretext of Matthias using this essentially to undermine Rudolf. But despite the fact that Matthias is essentially the one who promulgates this and scapegoats Rudolf for these various failings as part of the succession struggle, which then also brings in the support of his cousin Ferdinand of Further Austria, who was also ruling in Styria at this time. Now, Ferdinand, later become Ferdinand II, had ruled in Styria since 1596 and had received a Jesuit education. Oh, someone's noticed. I think, have I got this on my image? I'll just double check. Yes, I have made a mistake. That is Ferdinand II. The image here on the right is not supposed to be Rudolf II. I changed the images around. I must not have. So, for example, you see here, that is Rudolf II. So thank you, John, not real name, for correcting me on that. Yes, the picture on the right is Ferdinand II. Thank you for pointing that out. Ferdinand had ruled Styria since 1596 and received a Jesuit education, and had been more or less successful in eliminating what had been a Protestant stronghold in the center of southern Austria. And this Catholic fervor exhibited by Ferdinand II was such that it even made the new King of Spain, Philip III, the son of Philip II, balk. Rudolf is therefore less remembered as the emperor who ruled for nearly 40 years as a prelude to the 30 Years' War, but as a patron of the Rudolphine mannerism, late mannerism art moving into the Baroque, and other fields of astrology and alchemy, linking this into our conversation about Giordano Bruno, because of course Francis Yates also writes a book on Hermeticism, which includes emphasis on Giordano Bruno. He moves his court to Prague, and he enlists the services of none other than the court astronomer to Elizabeth I, a polymath and spy, John Dee, in the pursuit of the Philosopher's Stone, which supposedly gives immortality. And this tangentially links this interest in the occult and what you could say the budding sort of scientific revolution, and this attempt to understand and qualify nature and infinity, which of course we're seeing the exact same trends in the Low Countries and Italy, but this is received considerable patronage by the Emperor Rudolf. The Emperor Rudolf, it also should be noted, is responsible for the beautiful Rudolphine crown and the crown jewels of the Austrian monarchy. So in terms of a savant and an occultist, he has a remarkable reputation, which is almost at complete odds with the political situation which is brewing behind the scenes, because Rudolf doesn't take one deliberate stance, either pro-Protestant or pro-Catholic. And this is where we get into this idea on the other side. We talked about Re-Catholicization, and now we're talking about the occult and the possibility for a new Reformation. And this particular article is linking to the Smith article I have in the description on the Rosicrucians as sectarian radicals. Rosicrucianism grew out of the stock of Renaissance humanism as refracted through apocalyptic and utopian ideals of late 16th century Lutheranism. Lutheran Pansophism represented a curious mixture of heterodox, so Protestantism, Parcel Sans science, Neo-Joshemite prophecy, and millennium again, I do forget my pronunciation, millenarian idealism, made possible in part on account of official Lutheranism's generally positive attitude towards natural philosophy. And again, linking this back to the occult influence on Rudolf II. In a more general way, it reflected a habit of mind that was increasingly aware of the antithesis between the observation of appearance and the intuition of an underlying reality. In a time of eschatological expectation, occult wisdom offered a way of comprehending the great questions that vexed mankind, the expectation of the completion of the reformation of the world, the conclusion of the struggle between good and evil, the end of history, spurred even greater efforts to find the hidden meaning and events to discern the universal purpose that lay beneath them. There were distinct political implications to the occult movements of the later 16th century. They reflected an ambitious mentality which sought to find unity in the chaos of a religiously divided world. As Bruce Moran has noted, and his Philosophia Hermetica constituted an official court philosophy in much of Germany. Occult science offered the image of a unified creation, in which each part reflected the whole of the cosmos. Within that scheme, the monarchy increasingly was perceived as the source, the genesis of earthly and heavenly harmony. The essential connection between macrocosm and microcosm assumed that manipulation of the parts might bring about a transformation of the whole. When adapted to the political context, the relationship between microcosm and macrocosm offered precisely the right sort of analogy for German princes seeking to justify personal claims to individual authority within the political universe of the Holy Roman Empire. Since occult philosophy offered metaphysical support for the prince's own separatist claims, it was potentially dangerous doctrine, especially when linked to millenarian, for some reason I can't pronounce that word, millenarian speculation. As Poikert suggested, the Rosicrucian manifestos have to be seen in the context of the intensification of of political polemic in the late 16th century and early 17th century. Wackamitist calculations identified 1585, 1588, and 1591 as possible dates for the end of the world. 1617, the centenary of the Reformation, likewise, appeared to be a year of destiny to Lutheran observers. There was an assumption that the new Reformation would be accompanied by political change. The prognostications surrounding the years 1585 and 1589, for example, appeared in retrospect to have been fulfilled in such events as the execution of Mary Stuart, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the assassinations of the Duke of Guise and Henry III of France, events in France and Netherlands, as well as local and regional aristocratic revolts in Germany, Austria, and Bohemia, suggested a close connection between religious enthusiasm and rebellion. More surprisingly, there was a spectre of a new peasants' war, a Münzerisch uprising that would threaten the very foundations of society. Now, linking this back to the actual sort of specific conflicts and this intensification towards conflict, from 1583 until 1588, there is this overall dissatisfaction with the idea of the Ecclesiastical Reserve, as mentioned earlier, this idea that when a prelate converts to another religion, he has to forswear his ecclesiastical province. This happens in Cologne when the archbishop converts to Calvinism and attempts to apply the principle set out by the Peace of Augsburg, Quis regio, ius religio, and this begins the Cologne War. Maximilian, and in terms of the intensifications, that's one sort of major conflict, a fully fledged war in 1583 to 1588. In 1597, Maximilian becomes Duke of Bavaria, and in 1606, he intervenes in the Lutheran town of Donauwörth, and he converts the town to Catholicism. And afterwards, he directly annexes it to Bavaria, and this is with the approval of Rudolf. Now, the precedent here is the confiscation of Protestant property and a lack of neutrality from the emperor. And again, to my mind, this perhaps contributes to the build-up for the brotherly quarrel and his deposition by his cousin Matthias, as the whole idea essentially is that this fundamentally undermines imperial authority as the ultimate arbiter between Catholics and Protestants. And of course, it encourages Frederick IV, the Elector Palatinate, to form the Protestant Union, and Maximilian of Bavaria, the Catholic Union, in response. Now, very interestingly here, we have the two branches of the Wittelsbach family, each leading the two opposing religious factions, the Palatinate branch leading the Protestant Union and the Bavarian branch leading the Catholic Union. In 1609, as tensions were flaring up in the empire, we also have the War of Eulic Succession, and of course Spain concluded a 12-year truce with the Dutch Republic in the same year. Spain, for its part, had lost naval dominance to the Dutch and needed to preserve a land route linking its disconnected possessions, a route that of course ran through the Palatinate. Frederick V becomes Elector from 1610 and marries Elizabeth Stuart in 1613. And it's after this point that we have the Rosicrucian manifestos in 1614 and 1615, produced by the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross, ideal image of which is produced in the centre. And essentially the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross presents themselves as the anti-Jesuits, offering a means of universal and general reformation that was denied and was supposed to happen, but then of course became the Tridentine Reform. Now, Francis Yates, the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, tries to understand these manifestos in light of that marriage between Elizabeth Stuart and Frederick V of the Palatinate, a political marriage of the German and English aspects of the occult, which was also, supposed to also be the beginning of this major essentially, wartime coalition against the forces of Catholicism. And this is a brief summary offered by Smith in response to essentially the reception received by the Rosicrucian Enlightenment. The Rosicrucian Enlightenment has not enjoyed universal acclamation. In a particular review, Brian Vickers described the book as a triumph of rhetoric over evidence, concluding that her argument is an edifice built not on rock nor on sand, but on air. If the findings and methodology of that book come to be accepted or used as models for imitation, the results could be disastrous. Yates argued that the Rosicrucians derived from Christian Kabbalism of a sort of associated with Georgi and to a lesser extent with Reuchlin. The messianic movement of Rosicrucianism had its origins in the court occultism of Elizabethan England, finding its grandest expression in the scientific British imperialism of John Dee. Dee's variety of esoteric thought, according to Yates, found fertile ground in the court of the Palatinate. The Rosicrucian manifestos then represented the export of Elizabethan occult philosophy to Germany, with the royal wedding as the outward and visible sign of the reception of this new culture. But as R.J.W. Evans, not to be confused with Richard Evans, and others have shown, Yates seriously overstated the role of John Dee, whose influence on German occultism was belated and fairly minor. And while her theory connecting the appearance of the Rosicrucian manifestos to the wedding of Frederick V to the Princess Elizabeth is an attractive one, it nevertheless presents grave obstacles. Robin Barnes has argued that Yates seriously exaggerates the political aspects of the Rosicrucian movement. What we know about the origins of Rosicrucianism make it difficult to associate, as Yates did, with the Rosicrucian movement with Calvinism. The known supporters of the movement were almost all Orthodox Lutherans, and parallels between the Rosicrucians and the other learned societies in Germany have been demonstrated. That some apocalyptically minded Lutheran looked to the Palatine Elector as a leader in their struggle against the Habsburgs had less to do with the elector's intellectual virtues than the fact that the Saxon Elector, historically the focal point of Lutheran political loyalty, refused to play his part assigned to him by the radicals. And of course, this is referring back to the struggle with the Saxon branches, the Ernestine branches, and the Albertine branches, and the fact that the Saxons were more or less content with the peace, refused this idea that they would become the Lutheran leaders of a German resistance, and more or less were content with the status quo, so long as the emperor wasn't actively trying to undermine the idea of German liberty as construed with the Peace of Augsburg. The idea that a common passion for the occult drew together England, the Palatinate, and German Lutherans on the eve of the 30 Years' War appears on close examination to be far less likely than Yates would have us think. The speculative nature of so much of the argument ensures that the Rosicrucian Enlightenment must remain, as Charles now suggests, a book in the subjective mode. At one point I want to add to this, because again it's very interesting, and I'm sadly in the camp where I do believe that the association with the Calvinist elector of the Palatinate, who was also known as the Palatine Elector, his official role is much more to do with power politics, and this doesn't sort of represent some coalescing of all of these political ideas. But one point I need to note is the actual stance, not just of English occultism. So we talked about John Dee. We've also talked about not only John Dee's possible association with court culture, court occultism, but specifically with Rudolf II. Bringing this back to England. England, the policy of England at that time was neutral, and for any readers out there of the English Civil War, you'll no doubt know that Parliament wanted desperately for England to be involved in some way in a campaign against the Spanish, and by extension the Holy Roman Empire. And when James I, because of course the Stuarts arrived in 1603, and James I maintained a policy of peace. When James I did intervene in the war in 1621, it was more or less to placate Parliament and try to come to a negotiated settlement with the Spanish. And this again was very much a response to the fact that he'd have been accused at that point of Spanish sympathies, especially the Spanish sympathies of his favourite Buckingham. So whilst it's interesting to note that this could have formed some sort of international coalition built around this idea of a totalizing Reformation, the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, it really should be noted that the English intervention really didn't manifest, and the political sort of significance of Elizabeth Stuart marrying the Elector of the Palatinate really sort of amounted to nothing in the end, other than nominal support after the emperor tried to dispossess her rights as the electress of the Palatine. And here we finally get onto the war. As part of his ongoing conflict with the Protestants of Bohemia, and as a desperate attempt to shore up his authority against Matthias, going back to Rudolf II, Rudolf II promulgated the Letters of Majesty, granting concessions to the Bohemian Protestants to no avail, as he was deposed by Matthias, his cousin, in 1612. Or rather, he was succeeded as emperor in 1612, and Matthias deposed him selectively from 1608 through to 1611. Matthias confirmed those concessions, though he moved his court from Prague to Vienna. The short rule of Matthias was focused on a last attempt at conciliation orchestrated by Cardinal Kletzel. The Catholic opposition was mounting from within the family, led by his brother and assumed heir Maximilian. However, Maximilian was advanced in age. I think he was around his late 50s, nearly 60 at this point, and childless, so the hopes of the Catholic opposition to Matthias fell on Ferdinand of Further Austria, which has already been introduced. Ferdinand was formally adopted as Matthias's son, but Kletzel attempted to prevent his acknowledgement as heir until Maximilian finally managed Kletzel's dismissal in 1616. Had Kletzel succeeded and Matthias been able to achieve a third position, impugning the influence and the Pope and impugning the influence of the Pope and the Jesuits, the imperial faction may have come to resemble the politique of Catherine de' Medici, steering a path of conciliation between the Huguenots and the Catholic League, i.e., what happened in France. And of course, the Huguenots, Huisgenoten, housemates, Confederates, we're talking about Calvinists in the Holy Roman Empire as well, as being one of the main instigators, or rather sources of discontent. I think this comparison is interesting because we start off talking about the Peace of Augsburg. Well, of course, the end of this conflict, we're talking about the Peace of Westphalia. When talking about links to the wars of religion in France, of course, we begin with the attempt at appeasing the Protestant nobility under Catherine de' Medici with the Edict of Saint-Germain. And of course, we end much later in 1594 with the Edict of Nantes, both of which are very similar and offer very similar concessions. So when we talk about the success, we're more or less talking about the elimination of the Catholic opposition led by the powerful Duke of Guise, and also Henry IV bribing a lot of these participants. And of course, we have how many wars of religion are supposed to be in France? 8 or something. So there is a link, I think, that can be drawn. But the difference here between what happens with the Holy Roman Emperor and what happens with the King of France is that the King of France has always been egged on by the Catholic League. There is a named Catholic League in Germany at this time, led by the Duke of Bavaria, Maximilian. But it should be noted that right from the start of the War for Bohemia, what distinguishes this conflict from the French Wars of Religion is the fact that the Emperor and the Catholic League form an alliance, as opposed to what we see in France, where the monarch is, vacillating between the supporting the Protestants and supporting the Catholics. And when we see events such as the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, it's very much drawn in desperation rather than as a prescribed sort of pro-Catholic policy. And of course, we see the opposite of that with Henry III's assassination of the Duke of Guise. Now, Ferdinand II's election was perhaps the most contentious of any Habsburg since Albert the Magnanimous, who never actually became a Holy Roman Emperor, who was elected King of the Romans. And of course, he's the cousin of Frederick III, who ushers in the second Imperial Habsburg family. Of course, the first one was much earlier when we talk about Rudolf I, but that's of course going off into a different tangent. Now, 3 of the 7 electors, we mentioned the fact that the Holy Roman Empire is an elected monarchy. There are 7 electors, and all you need to do is have a majority, although it's best if you have a unanimous election, and the Habsburgs are typically elected unanimously. 3 of the 7 electors were Protestant, so all it takes is one to switch sides, and potentially Frederick V of the Palatinate could have been named emperor. And understanding this and the weakness of the Habsburg position, essentially the Habsburgs are now going through a religious crisis, but they're also going through a civil war within the family. So again, we're embarking back to this old idea of the Wittelsbach Habsburg rivalry. Maximilian of Bavaria positions himself as a compromise candidate. Though he was uncompromisingly Catholic, he positioned himself as the candidate for Germany against Spanish Habsburg influence. And it should be noted that even Spain's support of the ardent Catholic Ferdinand II as King of Bohemia and Hungary, which essentially he, in stages, he was elected as King of Bohemia and Hungary before he was elected as King of the Romans and therefore Holy Roman Emperor. But even this had conditions attached to it. Support from his own family in Spain was contingent on the Austrians fully embracing Spain's foreign policy and joining them in a renewed offensive against the Dutch Republic once the 12 years truce was set to expire in 1621. Of course, Spain and the Netherlands had been at peace in 1609. Ferdinand's rule in Bohemia was therefore tenuous. The fact he needed Spanish support should indicate also the level of threat posed by the radicalized Protestant nobility. Ferdinand was suspected by the Protestants on account of his elimination of heresy in Styria, and yet was prudent enough to conform to the 1609 Letter of Majesty upon his election. When it appeared that Ferdinand was resolving all land disputes in favour of Catholics, the Protestant leader, Count Thurn, orchestrated the third defenestration of Prague, throwing the king's representatives from a window. Now, it should be noted that the king's representatives survived this. He's not the emperor yet. He won't be the emperor for a year. So it's the fact that the king of Bohemia is sending his representatives, not Matthias. Matthias is still alive. Of course, Protestant propaganda has it that the king's representatives land on manure and then survive. But if you actually look at the tower of the town hall where they were thrown out of, there is a slight slope from the second floor where they were thrown down, and it breaks the fall a little bit. But of course, the opposite for the Catholic propaganda is the fact that the supposedly angels were supposed to have rescued the representatives and carried them down to safety rather than sending them to an imminent death. Another little note that this, of course, is the third defenestration of Prague. For some reason, Prague does have a wonderful tradition of removing one's political adversaries by throwing them out of tall windows, but there you are. So now Count Thurn has orchestrated his coup in Bohemia. It now appears that the Bohemian vote, because of course Bohemia was one of the electors of the empire, was in contest, and that a new administration in Prague, with essentially a Protestant majority in Prague, could vote against Ferdinand and ensure he would not become emperor. So now we see the security of the Habsburg possessions and their continued hold over the imperial throne necessitates a speedy reconquest of Bohemia. I'm being asked by, was it the third defenestration? There was a defenestration during the Hussite Wars. There was also a lesser known defenestration in 1483. So this is the third defenestration, yes. When Matthias died in 1619, Matthias the Holy Roman Emperor, the Saxons abandoned their alliance with the Habsburgs, believing all was lost, and funded Frederick V and a mercenary army to assist Thurn. Only narrowly did the Habsburgs avoid a full-scale Turkish invasion at the same time, as the Ottomans were already at war with Poland and preparing for war with Persia. Transylvania, however, the Ottoman vassal, under their prince, Gabriel Bletin, did invade with Ottoman blessing. The Bohemian estates deposed Ferdinand and elected Frederick V of the Palatinate as king. Realizing the unlikelihood of his election as emperor, Frederick supported the candidacy of Maximilian of Bavaria. Maximilian, however, had dropped his candidacy, and on the 28th of August 1519, Ferdinand, now Ferdinand II, was elected emperor unanimously, the same day that news was relayed to Frankfurt that he had been deposed in Bohemia. And it should be noted that for any people who are being pedantic out there, one is not elected as emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. One is confirmed as king of the Romans. But the whole process by which the emperor or the king-elect has then to go down to Rome and be crowned has been abandoned essentially since Maximilian, the last one to do so, who was crowned in Bologna and not Rome, was Charles V. Together, Bethlen of Transylvania and Count Thurn besieged Vienna. Hungary had now been overrun. Ferdinand was forced to conclude a very favourable treaty alliance with Maximilian of Bavaria as leader of the Catholic League that assumed that with the defeat of Frederick V, his Wittelsbach cousin of the Palatinate, he would occupy the Palatinate, the Duke of Bavaria, and receive the title of the Elector that he very much coveted, while the entire war effort was to be funded by Ferdinand II. Saxony promised further aid to Bohemia in return for territorial concessions, namely the region of Lusatia, just northwest of Silesia. Saxony, after promising territorial concessions, it should be noted that Bethlen of Transylvania abandons Count Thurn to consolidate his rule in Hungary, after which he's elected as King of Hungary. There is an attempt at French mediation in terms of like French intervention during this entire period. We have the death of Henry IV in 1610. France is now ruled over by Louis XIII, and we see a constant escalation of French intervention as the situation in Germany changes. So this is the first French intervention, and it appears benign. It is essentially an attempt to stymie a complete reconquest of Bohemia by the Catholic League and Habsburgs. The offer for French mediation is rejected, and a Catholic army under the command of Count Tilly, a Spanish commander based in the Netherlands and in the service of Bohemia, he defeats the King of Bohemia, being Ferdinand. He defeats the rebel Bohemian army at the Battle of White Mountain. What remains of the rebel army quickly collapses, and the ruler for one winter, Frederick V, who will become known thereafter as the Winter King of Bohemia, flees along with 5/6 of the Bohemian nobility, while the 27 primary leaders of the uprising are executed, and it's still part of Prague mythology today if you ever go there. The nobility had vacated their property, and most of it was therefore confiscated and awarded to Catholic nobles. So a major re-intensification of what had already been anticipated, which is that Ferdinand had a very favourable land policy towards the Catholics and was trying to get around the various writs and promises, such as the Letters of Majesty, by resorting to these covert measures. And from 1621 to 6, the mask is completely off in the Habsburg possessions. And first Calvinists are told to convert or exile, and then Lutherans are told to convert and exile. And this, of course, is carried out by the Archdiocese of Prague and the various Jesuits who come in here, albeit there is a significant lasting Protestant presence, but they're no longer able to exert any sort of major political influence, as had been the case before the Battle of White Mountain. The Battle of White Mountain is really a turning point in Czech Bohemian history. The stipulation of Ferdinand's alliance with Maximilian meant that Maximilian was now within his rights to claim the Palatinate from the deposed Frederick V of Bohemia. Many German princes had tolerated Ferdinand's reconquest of Bohemia, not because of religious grounds, in spite of religious grounds rather, but rather the deposition of an anointed king has set a disturbing precedent against the inviolability of princes within the empire, i.e., if Ferdinand, the Holy Roman Emperor himself, is allowed to be deposed in one of his possessions within the empire, then what's to stop every single prince within the Holy Roman Empire being deposed when there are no legal rights anymore? Now, the issue is, with the implication of Maximilian's ambitions for the Palatinate, it meant violating the same principle, but worse, deposing a legitimate sovereign and an elector no less, who happened to be the leader of the Protestant League. This was interpreted as both an attack on the rights of the princes or the German liberty, and on Protestantism with the full blessing of imperial authority. Under such circumstances, the emperor could no longer be seen as the supreme arbiter of the factions in the empire, but as a partisan. Remember the response to the relatively minor annexation of Donauwörth, which precipitated the formation of the Protestant League in the first place and contributed to the downfall of Rudolf. So from here we see an escalation and a series of flurry of Catholic victories. In 1621, as I previously mentioned, we see the half-hearted intervention of James I, the resumption, more importantly, of hostilities between the Spanish and the Dutch. Here, the 80 Years' War, the Dutch Revolt, coalesces with the 30 Years' War in that both the Spanish and the Imperials support the conquest of the Palatinate, and the Spanish do this because it keeps their land route to the Netherlands open. As I mentioned before, the land route through from the Free County of Burgundy to Milan, connecting to Barcelona and Naples, runs through the Palatinate. Otherwise, you're dangerously close to French territory, and therefore your supply lines are vulnerable. In 1622, the Palatinate was occupied, and the Protestant army, along with Frederick V, fled to the Republic of the Netherlands, where he died. In 1623, Frederick was legally deposed, having already been chased from his territories, and his electorship was transferred through the insistence of Emperor Ferdinand II to Maximilian. In response, there was a Protestant retaliation at the Battle of Sattelorn. However, this Protestant rebellion was again defeated by Count Tilly. Effectively, at this point, this is 1624, the war within the empire appears to be over. And this is where we get on to the next complicated stage of the war, which is the foreign interventions period there are really two foreign interventions period, 1625 until 1635, and the period which we're going to cover less on this lecture, which is from 1635 until 1648. The reason being is because it overlaps with another lecture we're going to talk about, which is the rise of French absolutism. The fears of the Protestant princes who hadn't been directly involved in the conflict now revolved around a complete unravelling of the Peace of Augsburg through the restoration of Catholic church land. This had already been begun by Tilly with the Diocese of Halberstadt in Saxony-Anhalt, and this is far removed from the Palatinate. This is up in the northeast of Germany. Up until now, Brandenburg had remained neutral, and Saxony's support of Bohemia had amounted to nothing, and Saxony hadn't formally taken up arms against the emperor. Denmark, meanwhile, had been Protestant for a little less than a century and appealed to North German fears while increasing their trade dominance over the Baltic. Christian IV of Denmark was a prince of the empire as Duke of Holstein and became the military leader of the Lower Saxon Circle in opposition to Ferdinand, and this is an elected position. The Dutch, French, and English had already been financing the Danish to act against the Habsburgs in one way or another. In what was interpreted as a hostile act of rebellion, Ferdinand contracted Albrecht von Wallenstein, a Bohemian commander and now a major landlord and beneficiary of the flight of the Protestant nobility from Bohemia, to lead an expedition of 50,000 men to defeat the Danish. Attempts by Richelieu of France, and Richelieu is the Grand Chancellor, the chief minister of Louis XIII, who progressively from 1616 until 1624 begins to amass almost complete control over the domestic and foreign policy of France, defeating nobles and Protestant enemies at home, while exerting France's independence from Spain, and you can say reigniting the conflict. The Italian wars have been mainly fought over. Italy was essentially the battleground, but the main issue here is Habsburg versus French supremacy, and of course Cardinal Richelieu begins the you could say the restoration of French power vis-a-vis the Spanish and Habsburgs. This is the first attempt by Richelieu to organize a grand coalition against the empire. And this fails. And so when the Dutch begin this intervention, when they are confronted by Wallenstein, they have very little in the way of German support, and they only have foreign subsidies, not foreign arms. And this leads to the disaster at the Battle of Dessau Bridge in 1626. And the German princes, as it stands, were very wary of Danish domination as much as Habsburg domination. So in terms of looking at this purely as a religious conflict, this is resisting foreign domination or imperial domination, regardless of religious affiliation. Wallenstein's rapid success meant the restoration of imperial authority in the northeast of Germany, Mecklenburg, Pomerania, etc. And geographically, so do I have a map? Yes. Geographically, as you can see, this is very far removed from the Habsburg patrimony reasserted in Bohemia, and Silesia is also home briefly for a Protestant army, which continues to operate and devastates the area around Breslau. So this is far removed, but the point about this region strategically is it opens a potential new front to establish an imperial navy and a imperial threat to Denmark. So when we have the establishment of imperial authority in the northeast, this is essentially a launch pad, and the ultimate aim is to end Danish domination of the Baltic. The last time Germans had any such power over the Baltic was during the high water period of the Hanseatic League, which was really during the middle of the 15th century, which is long gone at this point. We're 200 years later. In order to compete with this plan, Wallenstein needed Stralsund, a military port capable of building an armada, capable of challenging the Danish fleet. This marks the end of the Danish intervention and the beginning of the Swedish intervention. Christian was defeated at Wolgast and sued for peace, while Gustavus Adolphus, the King of Sweden, successfully relieved the siege at Stralsund. For Denmark, the intervention had been an absolute disaster, and the effect of this in the long run was losing its preeminence not only in northern Germany, but indeed the Baltic, a vacuum soon filled by the Swedish Empire. Wallenstein, now generalissimo of the imperial army, was now given carte blanche to conduct the war as he saw fit. These tactics included extortion, land confiscation, plunder, and often with little regard to the nominal allegiances of the places he encountered. Building on excellent fears about the assault on German liberty, Wallenstein usurped the Duchy of Mecklenburg, an act which was opposed even by the Catholic League. With a decade of military success, Ferdinand confirmed Protestant fears by passing the Edict of Restitution, undoing all Protestant confiscations of church property since 1555, which, as violations of the Peace of Augsburg, Ferdinand believed was completely within his legal right. He simply did not have the ability to enforce it. Calvinism had grown to prominence despite its lack of recognition from Augsburg, and the intended effect of the edict, more than damaging Lutheranism, was to essentially end Calvinist landholdings. The fact Ferdinand resorted to edicts without going through the Diet again evokes this idea of Ferdinand upholding not only Catholic power in Germany than the Holy Roman Empire, but absolutism, monarchical absolutism, as opposed to this idea of ruling through consensus, ruling through the Commonwealth, ruling through this idea of consent through the diets, through the estates. And this is seen as not just a religious assault on the Peace of Augsburg, even though, you know, Ferdinand very much believed he was legally within his rights to do so. But the Protestant German princes and some of the Catholic princes believed that this was an assault on the liberty of the German principalities, which had been established by the Golden Bull in 1356, which itself was continuing of the traditions which had borne out of the Great Interregnum and the collapse of the Hohenstaufen patrimony in Swabia, which is going way back. Riccio once again intended for another intervention, this time led by Sweden. Sweden had arisen as an independent power after having been ruled by Denmark, and in the process, ruled by Denmark, having shackled off Denmark and the Kalmar Union in I believe, the 1520s and the 1530s, and in the process adopted Protestantism under their dynasty founder Gustav Vasa. By 1630, Sweden was a powerful, centralized, and wealthy nation on the cusp of overtaking Denmark, despite its relatively small population of around 1 million. And contrast that, the population of Sweden, 1 million, to the 9 million denizens of just the Habsburg monarchy. I understand using the word Habsburg monarchy is a bit of an anathema. Really, that term should only be used after we see the decimation of the Spanish Habsburgs. When I say Habsburg monarchy, I'm talking about the domains of the Holy Roman Emperor. So these include Austria and Bohemia and parts of Hungary. As you can see on this map on the left, I'll just get back to my previous map so you can see Gustavus Adolphus. Now, despite having this small population of roughly around 1 million, the Swedish state could effectively tax and conscript its population through the parish registration system. Domestically, however, Sweden was ruled by Chancellor Axel Oxen, Oxten, Stellina, which it should be noted that Gustavus Adolphus wasn't just a military genius, but his rule was very much assisted by his Grand Chancellor. On the military aspects of Gustavus Adolphus, in military organization and strategy, Gustavus was ahead of his time. While most powers relied on mercenary troops, he organized a national standing army that distinguished itself by its discipline and relatively high moral standards. Deeply religious, the king desired his soldiers to behave like a truly Christian army. His stern measures against the common practices of looting, raping, and torture were effective until his death, and again in stark contrast with Albrecht von Wallenstein. His successes were due to this discipline, his use of small mobile units, the superiority of his firearms, and of course his personal charisma when leading men into battle. From Stralsund, Sweden invaded Germany with 18,000 men. Other than satisfying French strategic concerns by opening up another front against the Habsburgs, the idea that the Swedish intervention was founded on religious concerns is as erroneous as to assume that was the case with Denmark. An imperial Stralsund, i.e. a Stralsund dominated by Wallenstein and used as support by Ferdinand II, would mean a loss of commerce and a new Baltic power to rival Sweden. Sweden's presence was therefore resented by the Germans, especially Brandenburg and Saxony, the two main powers in the northeast and the two electors. The French, therefore, played a key role in sustaining the opposition to the empire by mitigating the conflict of interest between these parties by bribing them. Wallenstein had been removed in 1630 from his command as generalissimo of the imperial forces, since Emperor Ferdinand was concerned with the alienating effects of his tactics and Wallenstein's considerable personal wealth and power that could potentially rival the empire. And of course, we later see there are issues supposing his allegiance. Count Tilly resumed his command of the Catholic forces, only to be defeated at the devastating Protestant victory at Breitenfeld and killed at the River Lech. Wallenstein was then recalled by Ferdinand and defeated Gustavus Adolphus at Alta Veste after Gustav had invaded as far south as Fürth in Bavaria. The Swedes narrowly won at Lutzen, only to lose Gustavus Adolphus in the process. Lutzen was nominally essentially a Swedish victory, the Swedish claimed victory, but the fact that the king, King Gustavus Adolphus, died was a major blow. But it was also a devastating impact on Wallenstein, who was kept in power because of his assumed invincibility, despite his methods and his massive accumulation of wealth and power. This invincibility sustains him in power, and thereafter it's no surprising that after Lutzen in 1632, he is accused of treason when he is seen as to have failed to assist the imperial army under a Bavarian commander at the Battle of Oldendorf. With rumours abounding that Wallenstein would defect, he was arrested and then assassinated during a military purge orchestrated by loyal officers to Ferdinand called the Eger bloodbath. Of course, Eger is was part of Bohemia, the German rendering, I think, of Cheb in the Czech Republic. Without his generalissimo, or Tilly, Ferdinand became dependent on the Spanish, who delivered him a crushing victory at Nordlingen against the Swedish, now organized as the leaders of the Heilbronn League, with the Swedish Chancellor as its director. Nordlingen effectively reversed all of the gains made by Sweden and the League. So effectively, for all intents and purposes, the intervention had amounted to nothing. The first peace concluded was the Peace of Augsburg in 1635. John George of Saxony now led the Protestant delegation. Ferdinand agreed to revoke the Edict of Restitution and confirm the status quo before 1628, and the appropriations of Wallenstein were effectively undone. However, this secured most Catholic gains. The Heilbronn League and Catholic leagues were dissolved in an attempt to prevent foreign interventions in the empire. Rather, all principalities of the empire committed to mutual defense of the empire as nominally part of an imperial army. But this idea was never fully realized right up until 1806, when we see the destruction of the empire at the hands of Napoleon. Added to this was a general imperial amnesty. On the one hand, we also talk about small territorial concessions made, such as the emperor agreeing to hand over Bohemian Lusatia to Saxony. On the surface, this proposal was favourable to the emperor, and for all practical purposes, it was as if the interventions had amounted to nothing. The principles of Augsburg were re-upheld, and the emperor had restored his legitimacy and supremacy whilst bolstering the Catholic position. While Prague laid the foundations for the later Peace of Westphalia, it did not end the interventions, and Ferdinand would die in 1637, 11 years before that peace. At the same time the Peace of Prague was being promulgated, France declared war on Spain after over a decade of proxy wars. France had been the leading provocateur in the interventions and could not countenance and accept an acceptance of failure against the Habsburgs after Nordlingen. War was therefore the logical response to peace within the empire that could serve only to strengthen the Spanish. From 1635 until 1659, this conflict was a major international struggle for primacy in Europe between the Spanish Habsburgs and France. If anything, the German domestic aspects of the war became a peripheral strategic consideration. The Franco-Spanish conflict will form a major part, as I mentioned, of a subsequent lecture. So returning purely to the German aspects, which have lost a lot of their luster after the demise of the two great protagonists of the war, or rather three, Tilly Wallenstein and Gustavus Adolphus. The Swedish intervened again and defeated the Imperials at Wittstock, while the French defeated the Bavarian army at Rheinfelden. The Saxons remained loyal to the emperor after the Peace of Prague and paid for it dearly. By 1642, the Swedes had won the Second Battle of Breitenfeld and had conquered nearly all of Saxony, other than Freiburg. The death of Cardinal Richelieu and Louis XIII was of little impact, as the war was taken up by Cardinal Mazarin. Though while the French won a victory against the Spanish at Rocroi, they were defeated in Germany at Tuttlingen. Denmark briefly entered the war alongside the emperor against France and Spain, again to try and restore this loss of prestige and position in the Baltic since the reign of Gustavus Adolphus. The new Emperor Ferdinand III could not end the international conflict, but he could ensure peace within the empire. Serious negotiations began in 1646. The Elector of Bavaria, Maximilian, still alive at this point, had been ruling since 1597. Bore the brunt of the French and Swedish expeditions to the empire, and in order to ensure his gains in the early stages of the war, had a vested interest in peace. Bavaria signed a separate peace at Ulm in 1647. The Dutch, who had fought the Spanish on and off as a de facto state since 1579, the Union of Utrecht, now grew as wary of the French as the Spanish. And the impetus for this, what really forces the Dutch in a rather favourable position to conclude a treaty with the Spanish, is the leaked memoranda from Olivier, the Spanish Chancellor, which basically details that the French wanted possession over the Spanish Netherlands, and they were prepared to give Catalonia, which had revolted against Spanish rule and was now given over to France, back. So the idea that the French would now be controllers of the southern Netherlands effectively placed the Netherlands in an awkward position, where France, who was up until now their erstwhile ally, was now going to be their major military threat. And so rather than allow that to happen and to play the two powers off each other, we have the Peace of Munster with Spain in 1648, which finally grants recognition of Dutch independence from the Spanish. And the reason this is significant as well, because it also more or less legally makes the Dutch Republic independent of the Holy Roman Empire as well. Even though this takes a long time for it to be acknowledged, it's not really acknowledged until the early 18th century by the Austrian branch of the family that the Netherlands are fully independent. But for all intents and purposes, by 1648, the Dutch are independent from Spain and they are independent from the empire, and this is an acknowledged fact. However, going back to the Peace of Ulm, the separate peace signed by Bavaria, the defection of Bavaria in particular caused long-time Imperial Bavarian commander Bronkhorst Gronsfeld to join another Imperial commander von Holtzappel to engage a Franco-Swedish army under the command of French Marshal Turenne and the Swedish commander Wrangel at Soesmerhouse. And the Swedish campaign after this point, and that was, of course, a major defeat for the imperial forces. The Swedish campaign, effectively now, because they were all understanding that peace was ongoing. There had been peace negotiations, peace feelers sent out from 1642, and peace negotiations would continue from 1646. So with the assumption of peace very, very much on the cards, the idea that peace was coming, the Swedish attacked Bohemia and they attacked Prague, and they essentially began a hit and run campaign where they would loot as much treasure as they possibly could and return it to Sweden, whilst there was an official war between these two empires, so to inflict as much damage on the emperor before final peace was made. The final treaties involving the end of the war are the Treaties of Oslerbrook, which ends the war with Sweden, the Treaty of Munster, not to be confused with the Peace of Munster to do with the Netherlands. This is the treaty that ends the war with France. And this is, officiated with both papal and Venetian mediation. There is an article I have here, which is a small excerpt talking about the historiography of the military side of war, and this is by Derek Croxton. Judgments against 30 Years' War strategy have a tendency to begin with indignation against the general violence perpetrated on the populace, and to move from there to a critique of strategy in particular. Thus, Joseph Engel writes, with a little too much vehemence, that the longer the war went on, the more it evolved into general hacking and stabbing. Despite all the frightening results for those involved, the war became a scrap over the best tactical advantages, when it did not simply give vent to the basest instincts of power and will to survive it. On an only slightly calmer note, Michael Howard describes it as a period in which warfare seemed to escape from rational control, to cease indeed to be war in a sense of politically motivated use of force by generally recognized authorities, and to generate instead into universal, anarchic, and self-perpetuating violence. These vague statements are typical of their subject for the latter period of the 30 Years' War. The less as military events have been studied, and the more prone historians are to characterize the violence and purposelessness as general or universal, without citing any details. Typically, Jeremy Black acknowledges that the period has received little scholarly attention, even as he denounces its strategy as ineffective. But although their statements are obviously overgeneralized and overdramatized, Engel and Howard are nevertheless important because they are in line with what other historians of the 30 Years' War in their critique of strategy, especially in their emphasis on lack of discipline among soldiers, disloyalty among many army commanders. The key element is the supply situation, which was understandably very poor. Historians repeatedly emphasize that war became its own goal. In other words, supplying the troops became its own justification and overshadowed diplomatic concerns. There is usually an assumption, sometimes stated explicitly, that armies were so busy searching for food and fodder they ceased to obey central commands. Robert O'Connell, for example, writes that armies, increasingly devoid of intelligible political objectives, to say nothing of regular logistics, tended to generate travelling mobs living in a symbiotic relationship with the countryside. The key elements in the pointless, ineffective warfare of the last part of the 30 Years' War were thus a complete breakdown in logistics, leading to a complete loss of control on the part of central governments. And this should explain why that is the case, why these armies essentially became nothing more than foraging parties. And I think you can empathize why that is the case when I read this out. Armies, comparative to the scale of the devastation, were relatively small, and the German contingents declined as the war went on. This is me speaking, not Croxton. The size of the armies at Alta Veste had around 150,000 combatants in a single battle, whilst there were roughly 250,000 men at under arms at that point. This is 1632. To around 160,000 total German combatants on all sides by 1648. The majority of deaths were due to disease, with total combat deaths at around 500,000, revising the exaggerated claims of 19th century historiography, which puts military deaths as high as 2 million, which, just to put this in perspective, were just over half the total military deaths from the Napoleonic Wars. There were, however, a vast number of civilian deaths. Relating this back to the idea of a general crisis of the 17th century, the empire's population fell from 18 million in 1600 to 11 million in 1650, though the vast majority of these deaths come from famine and disease, echoing similar developments in Italy. That is not to say the soldiery didn't have an effect on the civilian population, in addition to quartering, foraging, land confiscation. However, moving armies were the most reliable transporters of plague. So the fact that we see plague and famine, the devastation of the countryside, should make it very clear as to understand as to when we see the later period of the war, as the war progresses, why war essentially becomes a matter of foraging, but also as we can see the nature of the war degenerating, how essentially Germany the reason I want to focus on the war between 1618 to 1635 rather than the war after that, and indeed the causes before then, is because that is very much the German phase of the conflict, where this is about the emperor ensuring peace within the empire. However, post 1635, post the intervention, Germany essentially becomes the battleground between the great struggle of the Spanish Habsburgs and the French, and the Swedish, by extension, their French allies. So the allies of France, however. So it should therefore be obvious as to why the devastation in Germany was so great. And look at the areas of conflict here. So the most devastated areas in terms of depopulation were, of course, the area around Württemberg through to the Palatinate, which were invaded and invaded again and again and again. And this area in the north, the area around Pomerania, which of course was the main site of Swedish objectives. Now we see this little area in the middle, this area connecting Thuringia with Franconia. Of course, that was the constant direction of Swedish advances south. And when we see the final stage of the war, we're seeing the French invading Bohemia from the west and the Swedish invading Bohemia from the north, as Bohemia under Maximilian was the most consistent Catholic imperial partisan aligned with the emperor. But of course, as you can see, the empire itself, with the exception of Bohemia and Silesia, is relatively unscathed and comes out rather well from this conflict. Now, getting to the Peace of Westphalia, when it comes to the Peace of Westphalia, the general provisions of Prague and Augsburg were upheld. Importantly, however, Calvinism was finally recognized and had the rights essentially of Lutheran rulers. And of course, there were also religious minorities that could exist within the domains of a ruler of a different religion. Now, coming to the territorial aspects, the emperor acknowledges French gains in Alsace, the Decapole, the 10 imperial cities that formed a league of their own, while Sweden gained territory in Pomerania, as did Brandenburg Prussia. The Swedish army was then gradually demobilized from its various mobile units throughout the empire, but this took until the middle of the 1650s. Nor was there peace in the empire. There was not universal peace in the empire, because Mazarin was very insistent that the Peace of Westphalia, or rather in this case the Treaty of Munster, deliberately excluded the Burgundian circle, i.e. the parts of the empire which were ruled over by Spain. So Spain remained at war with France until 1659. In terms of the actual sort of constitutional changes, one of the constitutional changes is the insistence on the importance of the Imperial Diet. And from 1663, 15 years after the peace, the Diet meets in permanent session in Regensburg thereafter. So rather than a weakening the imperial, the imperial sort of constitution, we actually see a strengthening of it. And of course, this is a response to what was considered the most infamous of all of Ferdinand II's edicts, the Edict of Restitution. The idea, of course, is to bring back this idea of the Commonwealth in contrast to Habsburg absolutism. But again, contrasting this again, yes, the Habsburgs had to concede some very superficial gains to the princes in the empire, but all of this, again, is continuous with the concessions that had already been made by Charles V at the Peace of Augsburg and promulgated by Ferdinand I. If anything, the empire, the Habsburg possessions are now in a stronger position, because from 1648 onwards, the Counter-Reformation is allowed to continue in earnest. The Protestant nobles in Bohemia, which is one of the richest parts of the Habsburg patrimony, are significantly weaker. And as I mentioned, it's a fundamental turning point in Czech history. So the Habsburgs come out of this with a consolidated empire united behind Catholicism. And the Re-Catholicization effort, which I alluded to earlier, really much continues completely unabated in Habsburg lands. And of course, this also happens in Bavaria as well. And as we'll see when we come to the 18th century, even the former sort of champion of Lutheranism, the Elector of Saxony, converts to Catholicism in order to be elected as King of Poland. So the idea that this was just a devastating conflict for Germany is complicated. It's not that straightforward. And of course, right in the center, right between these areas of devastation, is Brandenburg Prussia, Well, from 1648, Brandenburg Prussia is an elector, but it seems rather unassuming. Of course, within 100 years, Brandenburg Prussia is going to be one of the primary European great powers, and 100 years after that, it is going to be the force for uniting Germany. So obviously, the effects of the war weren't as devastating as implied, but there is a misnomer which comes out of this, which is why I wanted to look at the whole century from 1655 until 1648, rather than just looking at the conflict in isolation, just with the immediate causes for the war, because there is this idea of Westphalian sovereignty. In the same way that the Edict of Nantes is seen as, a great sort of original and monumentous instance in France, I will be the first one to point out that the Edict of Saint-Germain, promulgated at the beginning of the regency of Catherine de' Medici in 1562, said effectively the same thing. Well, did I say 1655? I meant 1555 to 1648, if I did say that, John, not real name. Thank you for pointing out my mistakes. I do try and be as conscientious when it comes to this sort of thing as possible, but I do, especially when it comes to centuries. I remember one of my episodes, I said I kept using the 19th century instead of the 9th century. So it does happen, and I'm very grateful if you point this out so I can correct myself as we go along. But I'm pushing back now against this idea of Westphalian sovereignty. I'm sure most of you have heard of that term, even if you don't necessarily know what that means. Westphalian sovereignty is again even adopted as part of the sort of the international relations mantra, which is the idea of independent nation states and nations not interfering within the eternal affairs of said nation. Now, the idea that Westphalian sovereignty, or a Westphalian revolution, in terms of our understanding of international relations coming out of this piece, is completely fallacious. And I'm not sure how many of you have been exposed to lecturers, professors in international relations, but essentially in this case, it is a debased form of history in order to correlate this to an oversimplified theory of politics. Because what we see with the Peace of Westphalia is fundamentally very little in terms of its revolutionary character, away from the Peace of Augsburg. Yes, we have the idea which had already been established at the Peace of Augsburg, which is, you can say, the bedrock for this idea of Westphalian sovereignty, which is cuius religio, ius religio, which is the idea that the ruler determines the state and that the emperor doesn't have the right to determine the religion of the various lands under the German Confederation. But this is still conceived in a hierarchical fashion. One of the myths that comes out of Westphalian sovereignty is this idea of essentially removing hierarchies in international relations. And part of this, again, sorry, John, not real mate, is getting me. Anyway, sorry. I've been contacted in the comments section and it's distracting me. But yes, the other myth associated with Westphalian sovereignty is this idea of removing hierarchical relations. And of course, that's simply not the case with the Peace of Augsburg. The Peace of Augsburg is predicated on an emperor acting as mediator and as upholder of the peace. And of course, the emperor has a vested authority, as we saw with Rudolf II, Maximilian II, and even the conception of monarchy, the politique conception of monarchy, as articulated by Cardinal Kletzel. The idea that the emperor should be convoking his own religious policy, and he shouldn't just be a puppet of the Holy Roman Emperor, of the papacy. So at the same time, you're trying to come up with a religious settlement which asserts your power in Germany and doesn't just make you a stooge of the Pope. Was very much the thinking of the Austrian branch of the Habsburg dynasty, less so perhaps than the case with Philip II, even though Philip II still had Ghibelline pretensions as the son of the universal emperor Charles V. So this whole idea, first of all, that we get strict non-interference within domestic affairs is, again, fallacious, because it's predicated on you adhering to a form of legally recognized religion. In Augsburg, it's adherence to Lutheranism. With Westphalia, its adherence to Lutheranism and Calvinism. There are still many religious tenets, such as Anabaptism or ultra-Christ Hussitism, which are definitely not accepted by these treaties. But again, this idea of eliminating hierarchy in international relations and treating First of all, the idea of a nation state is again almost preposterous when you look at the complex state in Germany with the existence of all these ecclesiastical territories, these states with certain hierarchies and precedents. For example, all of the various ancillary titles granted to the electors, etc. And the fact that ultimately the emperor is still conceived of as the nominal head of the whole thing. And this lasts even beyond the Holy Roman Empire. One of the great disputes over German unification is the idea that Bismarck is encouraging the very loyal King Wilhelm I to break his oath to the Habsburg Emperor, Franz Josef, and effectively order the entire sort of nature of German politics, turn it on its head and make Prussia the emperor and not Austria. This was something which very much concerned Wilhelm I, didn't very much concern Bismarck. But the idea that these feudal vassal relationships permeate 200 years, more than 200 years after the Peace of Westphalia, should again tell you that the whole notion of uniform or non-hierarchical nation state that's coming out of this idea of the Westphalian Revolution is utter nonsense. It's a convenient phrase for international relations experts concerning this. But what I'm talking about essentially is that despite the 30 Years' War, despite the devastation, the Holy Roman Empire as an entity remains intact, continues, and it continues under Habsburg domination. And when we see the, again, it takes another century before we see the next great challenge to Habsburg imperial authority. From 1648 until really the War of Spanish Succession, the Habsburgs' possessions are safe. And it's only really when we get to the War of Austrian Succession, so we're going all the way from 1648 until 1740 before we see the next great challenge to Habsburg imperial rule. And this is going to be because the main line of the Habsburgs died out with Charles VI, and we see the rise of Bavaria, and we see the Bavarian emperor, the first Wittelsbach emperor in 400 years, and we see the rise of Prussia at the same time. So yes, I think that's a good way to end this conversation. And of course, when we get back to Nations of Charlemagne, we're going to be picking this up by talking about Cardinal Richelieu and talking about the French sides of the conflict, which I alluded to here, but haven't really gone into much depth, because I don't want to find myself repeating all of these points in a future lecture. So yes, that is the end of the lecture. I'll just check to see if I have any super chats. If you did sort of write any question, do type it again so I can see it, but I'll go back through my comments to see if I did get, so I don't have any super chats, so I'll just go back through the comments. Do bear with me. John Not Real Name asks, is it true Emperor Rudolph II asked the Pope to force the Styrians to Catholicism, but the Pope was like, please no. The Pope at that time, so this would have been Clement VIII, if I'm correct. This would have been the 1590s. He had very little power when it came to Rudolph II had very little power when it came to the actual domestic policy within Styria. This would have been Ferdinand II, I believe, and Ferdinand II was known for beginning his own Reformation, his own counter-Reformation, essentially, which gives him this reputation, which makes him very feared by the Protestant nobility. But Clement VIII, in particular, was very much a conciliatory sort of pope, in complete contrast with his predecessor, Sixtus V, who was very ambitious. I don't know specifically, but it would make sense that Clement VIII, like Cardinal Kletzel, would be advocating caution so as not to undo Catholic gains, and also, create the situation of possible reprisals. Oh yes, you meant Ferdinand II, not Rudolph II. Well, I made that mistake too, so I can forgive you, John, not real name. Yes, I can understand that. And again, the argument advocated by Cardinal Kletzel was the fact that Ferdinand II was just a mindless zealot, and the more fervent his approach was in terms of Re-Catholicization, the more likely he was going to provoke a Protestant response that would have led to indiscriminate attacks on Catholic property. So yes, it's consistent that the papacy at the time would offer conciliation. But also note that Ferdinand II had a rough time coming to all of his possessions. He came to Hungary and Bohemia first, but he came to Austria last. Matthias dies in 1519. Because of the fraught situation, he tries to ensure his election before, essentially the estates of Bohemia can, flip the vote and maybe give it to Maximilian of Bavaria. He's able to ensure his election, and therefore he becomes Holy Roman Emperor. But then after, he needs to go back to Austria, and he finds himself having to deal with a war and having to, Vienna has just been under siege. And he asks his Jesuit advisors, is it within my remit? Is it theologically permissible that uh, that I can make these temporary peaces to the Protestants? And the Jesuits were like, yes, it is understandable. So very much when it came to Ferdinand II, he wasn't again a mindless fanatic, as is often the impression. And I think, again, when you're looking at his Catholic policy, he was very much anxious to give everything a veneer of legalism, such as the Edict of Restitution, which he believed simply was undoing all of the Protestant excesses or Protestant violations of that treaty. He believed he was completely legally within his rights. It wasn't that it was what he was doing was illegal or in contravention of again, this idea, strict sense of German liberty, but it's the idea that he's using these powers and he's enforcing these rules at a point where he is at the peak of his military power under Wallenstein. So there is this perhaps legitimate view among the Protestants that the increase of military success for the emperor would have led to a complete reversal of the Peace of Augsburg, and you could say trying to bring about that situation at the high point for Charles V of the Schmalkaldic League in 1547, when it appears that the Protestant situation has just been defeated by force. But of course, that doesn't happen, and Ferdinand II has to deal with various international interventions from 1625 onwards, which are again part of French intervening. John, not real name. Was it not common to install the heir to the throne as King of Hungary or Bohemia? Well, that certainly was the case of Ferdinand II. It was more the case that, again, it's not so common. When we come to the later Habsburgs, essentially, when it came to Ferdinand II in particular, we're looking at this within the context of the Austrian brothers' quarrel. The idea that Rudolf II, then his cousin Matthias, and these are from different branches. They're all descendants of Ferdinand I, the brother of Charles V, and therefore the Austrian branch, but they're all members of different branches of the family. The inner Austrian branch, the branch of Austria proper, the imperial line, and further Austria. Rudolf II has no children. He has plenty of illegitimate children, but he doesn't have any legitimate children. And therefore, the throne essentially is taken from him. He is deposed in the brotherly quarrel and deposed by Matthias. And Matthias, rather than taking over the title of Holy Roman Emperor, first of all takes over Bohemia and Hungary. And as is the case with establishing Ferdinand as the heir to the throne, you also have to put in context that this is the Austrian branch of the family asserting their rights to these territories. And there is another branch of the Habsburgs, the Spanish Habsburgs. So the idea is, if the succession is in contention and Ferdinand II is not to be Holy Roman Emperor, is not to be King of Bohemia, Hungary, and Lord over Archduke of Austria, etc., then it is possible that this will cause a succession war within the empire. So the logic of Matthias, as he had done with the deposition of his cousin, in making Ferdinand II his adopted son and then giving him these possessions before he died, and the expectation was that he was going to die very soon, is this idea that he can establish a power base and increase his prestige and legitimacy to ensure his election and to ensure the survival of the House of Habsburg, which by 1619 looks incredibly precarious, especially with the loss of Bohemia and the loss of the elector seat to go with it. Victor Vasquez for $15. Did the war destroy the long-term prospects of the empire, centralizing under the House of Habsburg? No, I think that was very much done with the Reformation. I would go to the Peace of Augsburg. I wouldn't go with the Peace of Westphalia and the 30 Years' War. Like I said, one of the weird results of the 30 Years' War, unexpected for people who aren't familiar with this topic, is that within the Austrian domains, the Habsburgs massively centralized. They weren't able to affect that policy after 1635. Had the war ended in 1635 and had the French decided not to intensify the conflict, their feud with the Habsburgs, and declare war in 1635, it is very possible that the Habsburgs in 1635 would have been in a much more favorable situation than the Habsburgs in 1555. And of course, when it comes to 1648, again, it took the direct intervention of France and Sweden to undermine Habsburg gains. But even with 1648, we don't see a fundamental sort of breaking up of the empire. And even if we look, to Swedish gains were not gains of the Crown of Sweden. Rather, they were Swedish holdings within the Holy Roman Empire. So Sweden did not have the legitimacy just to pull these territories in Pomerania out of the Holy Roman Empire. Essentially, Sweden agreed to become part of the mechanism of ruling the Holy Roman Empire. With France, when you look at the territories that France gained as a result of the 30 Years' War, they're relatively minor. We're talking about the Decapole region. But if you're looking at a deterministic view of history, as many French theorists and historians are now taking at this point, it is a small piece on the path for France fulfilling its goal of establishing a new boundary at the Rhine River, because France establishes a major presence around the Alsace region for the first time. Right. Pellinor Whitestrake, the empire lost any chance of centralizing after the Hohenstaufens, but even then, it would have been a tall order for the empire to centralize under the Hohenstaufens. I'm going to go even earlier and say that the empire lost any chance of centralization under the Salian dynasty. The only emperor who was able to effectively rule the empire as some form of centralized mechanism, despite the decentralized nature of the stem duchies, was Otto the Great. When you look at the Hohenstaufens, Frederick Barbarossa didn't want to centralize the monarchy. The reason people like Julius Evola love him so much is that Frederick Barbarossa was a true advocate for feudalism, even promoting his rivals. And again, this is why Charles V isn't so much as a centralizing monarch, because again, Charles V was a pure advocate of feudalism as well, and this idea of the liege vassal relationship. And with Charles V, I give it this romantic association that he conceived of all the major princes of Europe as part of this grand order of the Golden Fleece, with him as Grand Master. So again, when you talk about centralization, when I think of centralization in terms of the pure rise of monarchical power at the expense of all the other states, I don't think of really any German monarchs during this time. I think of people like Philip IV of France. Right. Simon Peterson, when would you say the nation state was really introduced then? That's a really complicated question. I mean, if you're talking about, when I'm talking about the nation state, I'm talking about the modern nation state as we conceive it, given some sort of guarantee in international law and given some sort of constitution or whatever, and not bound by all of these different affiliations, vassal lord relationships, etc. When we're talking about the idea of nationality, the idea of ethnos, this is an ancient idea. This goes all the way back to the idea of the Greek polity and the earliest a tribal confederation. From this, we have the emergence of what it is to be a nation. What I'm rebuking is the idea of a legalistic conception of Westphalian sovereignty. And what I also dislike about that is when you look at this idea of a general crisis of the 17th century, something else that informs that is this deterministic view on history, where the nation state, as conceived of in modern terms, has to arrive at some point, and this is a stepping stone on the rise to modernity, or what have you. And when you're looking at the German context, this tends to be fixated on Prussian nationalism, Prussia becoming a so-called modern state, an efficient state under Frederick II the Great, and Prussia then becoming the vehicle for German unification in the 18th century. Nationalism really sort of as a phenomena in terms of uniting an entire community around an ethnos rather than a religion or rather than adherence to a sovereign is really an idea that comes about in the late 18th century and is, vociferously promoted in the 19th century as a new form of national organization. But that's one form of nation state. But when I'm talking about the nation state in this context, I'm specifically rebuking the idea of Westphalian sovereignty. Right. France, you should have just submitted to the emperor. Absolutely. That's one point I'll probably, unless I have any last sort of flurry of super chats. People are being very kind about my my answers, so thank you very much. Well, if you want me to answer your question, do send a super chat. If you want me to guarantee that I will answer your question. But yes, regarding the idea of France just submitting to the emperor, what is why we shouldn't see the Peace of Westphalia and the 30 Years' War in isolation? France under Cardinal, people, often, when first encountering the subject, they say, oh, well, it's Protestants versus Catholics. And then you're like, okay, what's France got to do with it? And again, oh, well, I don't understand. France is Catholic. Why are the French Catholics, allying with the Protestants against that? Well, again, because older than the Reformation is the French Habsburg rivalry. The French Habsburg rivalry goes all the way back till 1477. The Reformation only goes back to 1517. This is an ancient conflict about the primacy of Europe and this idea of constructing a universal monarchy either under Spanish, Italian, Habsburg domination or under French domination with Louis XIV. So when we look at, the Schmalkaldic War, what is one of the decisive effects of the Schmalkaldic War? Why does everything turn sour very quickly for Charles V? It's the decisive intervention of Henry II in Lorraine, which again tips the balance and gives France that edge, because France is, as with Francis, as with Louis XII, as with Charles VIII, all of these monarchs are concerned with undermining Habsburg power and, as a result, imperial power in order to improve the temporal position of France, even though all of the French monarchs are Catholic. So it's impossible to see this purely as a religious conflict rather than a territorial conflict between these two powers. But also, when looking at the Habsburg princes, why is it Saxony, seen as the champion of Lutheranism, is fighting alongside the empire against the Swedes in the final stages of the war? It's because the Saxon electorate is promoting this idea of imperial unity, imperial peace, rather than Protestant victory in the war. So when we talk about an aspect of nationalism, an aspect of German imperial patriotism, that certainly exists at that time. And the idea that the emperor is supposed to be the guarantee of the ancient liberty of these estates, but also that the emperor is supposed to protect the estates from foreign intervention. I think, this is something, the impetus behind the Reichsreform of Maximilian I, when we see the rise of France. I think the tragedy of the 30 Years' War is that despite the power of the Spanish and the Habsburgs, the nature of this conflict, this great overarching conflict of the 16th and 17th century, which is this contest between the French and the Habsburgs, means that the role, essentially, the pivotal role of the Habsburgs as the defender of the Holy Roman Empire is compromised. And from 1625, the French advocate and facilitate these coalitions against the empire, and they invite absolute ruin. Especially the French and the Swedish interventions, because of course the Danish intervention was a bit of a damn squid. Okay, I'll just see if there's anything else, and then I'll go. Right, Simon Peterson, makes sense that non-German states at this time would be nations bound by an ethnos or monarch, but not in the legalistic international relations sense. Yeah, I mean, France is an obvious case of that. No one has done this before. He's making me feel guilty for asking questions. No, don't feel guilty for asking questions. Ask questions. It's as you can see, I enjoy it. France had no consolidated ethnos, just a king. Again, this is an idea of the conflict within France, of the généralité, and the creation of the various parlements as the French realm was expanding. But very much within France, there is this Parisian sort of Ile-de-France culture, and then you have the peripheral cultures in Lorraine, in the Pays d'Oc, in Provence, in Brittany, to a lesser extent in areas which have been sort of heavily subjected to assimilation, like Normandy. But even in France, this idea of ethnos being the overriding factor other than loyalty to the king would, before the French Revolution, be utterly absurd. Right. Philippocrit for €2. Reformation as founding myth distorts its import. I don't quite understand that. Reformation as founding myth distorts its importance, maybe? Significance? I mean, the Reformation is a founding myth for a lot of sort of German states. I mean, it's very hard to conceive of, a through line for Prussian history in particular. In the sense that Prussia becomes, a vehicle for this bi-confessional Protestant Calvinist struggle against the Habsburgs, but again, determined as such as oversimplifying it. I would like to ask you just to elaborate on that. Founding myth is what? I mean, a founding myth of Germany, of German nationalism. Is that what you mean? But anyway, moving on from that, in terms of its religious identity, Reformation's founding myth distorts its importance. But again, in fairness to the Lutherans, I don't think the Lutherans, are happy with the idea of a strict break. Say, for example, with first of all, you have Lutheranism, emerging in 1517. You have the Diet of Worms in 1521, which the emperor places the ban on it. But the Augsburg Confession really is sort of the beginning of Lutheranism, the Confession of Lutheranism in 1530. I don't think you're having a founding myth necessarily distorts its importance. I think it's very important in any context when you're looking at religions to look at the various historicity, and I would apply that to Christianity. Right. I think that's it for me today. It's been over 2 hours. I wasn't expecting it to be this long, but there you are. You have me for free for extra time. What do I have to do? I have to shill. Right. Thank you, everyone who patronizes this channel. There will be a associated discussion with this topic on Monday. Other than that, the week after, we will be doing the rise of the Romanovs. So this is the end of Nations of Charlemagne for a couple of weeks. Then we're going to go back to orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality. Thank you all very much for listening, and good night, and have a wonderful Sunday.